Hi, everybody. Hope you're having a nice break. I wanted to get this posted for those of you who wanted to get started on this as soon as possible. So we have a nice long break. I wish I could give you the whole break off, but I'm going to ask that you do just a little bit. Read the corresponding chapter, chapter 25. I'd like you to do the DBQ, although I'm not going to have you do the whole DBQ. As I said in class, all you have to do is an outline, and I explain how to outline it, and I think that will give us good practice, especially pairing the documents. And I'd like you to watch this voice thread on World War II. And what I'm going to try to do is I go through World War II with you a little bit to supplement your reading. And World War II is one of those things that you learned a lot about in world history, and we're going to look at it from an American perspective. But I think you probably know a lot about World War II already. So I'm not too worried about you understanding World War II. But I want to talk a little bit about how World War II compares to World War One, and I want to model that for you a little bit. It's one of the most common essays on the AP exam, and I don't know if they're going to ask about modeling World War One and World War Two, but towards the end of this assignment, I'm going to ask that you go back and look at the Vietnam War. Now, we haven't talked about the Vietnam War yet. You can read about it in your book. Obviously, you have the whole internet at your fingertips that you can get information about. But I want you to think about how World War II compares to the Vietnam War. And I'm going to compare World War II to World War I. And I think that that will give us some good practice, not only understanding the content of World War II, but also, who knows, maybe if they ask either of those questions this year, we'll feel particularly prepared. So when we talk about World War II, much like when we talk about World War I, the beginning of it is not going to include the United States. As Adolf Hitler becomes aggressive in Europe, something that you've talked a lot about in world history, Neville Chamberlain goes to Munich and negotiates the Munich Peace Agreement. And this is one of the most important events in the 20th century. When Neville Chamberlain held up this piece of paper and waved it in the air, saying, "We have achieved peace in our time by giving in to Adolf Hitler, by giving in to his demands, by giving him Czechoslovakia. England has achieved peace in our time." This idea of appeasing an aggressive nation and the failure of appeasement is going to be revisited time and time and time again in the 20th century. And even today, when we talk about Saddam Hussein a few years ago, the idea that we could appease an aggressive nation, whether it was Saddam Hussein in 2004 or whether it was Saddam Hussein in 1992, the idea that we could appease an aggressive nation is widely considered to be a failure, in large part because of this. So this idea, this incident in world history, I should say, was a really, really important one. All right, I'm stumbling all over my words here. Let's see after this first slide if I can't do a better job. So the turn of events in America, I know you learned about this in world history, but what was going on in America as war raged in Europe, and similarly, as in World War I, the United States was not involved in the war initially. The United States was on the sidelines, looking across the broad Atlantic Ocean, glad that we had that physical distance from Europe, and glad that we could remain isolated and neutral from affairs. What's fascinating to me, and this is a real common question that the AP will ask, and whether they ask it or not, it's important for you to understand, is this idea that FDR had a country that really wanted to avoid war. This has a lot to do with World War I. Following World War I, many Americans believed that we shouldn't have gotten involved in World War I. As you remember, the Treaty of Versailles was widely disliked, ironically enough, because of the League of Nations. I say ironic because it was Woodrow Wilson's idea to even have the League of Nations in the Treaty of Versailles. Americans reverted back to isolationism. We think of Warren G. Harding's return to normalcy. That not only was a statement about domestic policy, but in some ways, and maybe even more importantly, in terms of foreign policy. So FDR, who sees the threat of Europe, has a very difficult job as president. we talk about leadership, and one of the interesting questions that we sometimes have in class, and I've discussed in the past, is a leader someone who does what the people want and follows what the people want, or is a leader someone who leads the people in a direction that possibly they don't even know is best for them? I think we see FDR fitting the definition, the later definition of those two, that he sees the threat in Germany way before most Americans do. Most Americans are very much against getting involved in the war in Europe, and I find that to be a really interesting connection to World War One, and obviously has a lot to do with World War One. So we see that. I wanted to do this chronologically just so you could kind of see this idea that FDR was moving America towards war. In 1937, FDR gave a speech that's called the Quarantine Speech. And in it, he said that these aggressive nations, speaking of Italy and Germany, needed to be quarantined, needed to be isolated from the rest of the world. And this speech was met with tremendous hostility in America. Why are we getting involved in European affairs? Why is our president making this speech? FDR, politically speaking, had to back away from this quarantine speech. So this quarantine speech is his initial reaction to Germany's aggression, Japan and Italy, but primarily Germany. And the American people really were not happy with it. The American people wanted America to remain isolated. The idea of World War One still lingered in their minds. Many Americans believe that we shouldn't have gotten involved in World War One. And it's followed by a series of neutrality acts. There's a bunch of them. But the gist of it is that we are not going to get involved in World War One. And if you remember the criticism that people had of World War One, it was that we were economically involved in the war through loans. We were trading arms. You might remember some of the idea that ships were being sunk, most famously the Lusitania. So the Neutrality Act said that we're not going to loan money. We're not going to sell weapons to any country that's involved in war. We're going to remain completely neutral. Now, as the war goes on, and as England stands alone, as France falls, as the war looks worse and worse for our allies, you're going to see that FDR is able to move the country towards being more involved in England's side. So initially, we're not going to trade weapons with anybody. FDR in 1939 is able to move to a cash and carry. If you come to America and you pay cash, we're not going to loan money. That's what got us involved in World War One, the critics said. But if you pay cash and you come and you pick it up, we're not going to deliver it. We can sell weapons to you. Now, this didn't specify England, but because England controlled the seas with their powerful navy, only England could sail to America to pick up the weapons. So, a tiny step away from neutrality, we're moving towards helping England. 1940, the Destroyers for Bases deal. The United States gave 50 naval destroyers to England in return for the right to lease naval bases. Again, we're moving towards helping England. 1940, the Selective Service Act. We draft. It's one of the few times in American history where there's been a peacetime draft. FDR said we needed to prepare. Not that we were going to war, but we needed to prepare for war. FDR also, FDR also ramps up the rhetoric. He gives two very famous speeches. One, the Arsenal of Democracy speech, as the name implies, that we don't have to fight, but we can be an arsenal for democracy. We can provide the weapons. We can hand we can hand England the ships and the bombs and the planes and the tanks. We can be an arsenal for democracy. And the For Freedom speech, one of the most famous speeches in American history. You know, we have the internet now. If we were in class, I would probably pull this up and have you listen to it. I encourage you to go to YouTube and type in For Freedom speech FDR. I'm sure it's there. One of the greatest speeches in American history, really. The Atlantic Charter. This was a secret meeting, and the secrecy and the spy atmosphere surrounding this is kind of legendary. They actually had a fake FDR pretend to be going around, in the limousine, while FDR was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean meeting with Winston Churchill, actually discussing post-war goals. So in 1941, before we're even involved in the war, FDR is meeting with Winston Churchill discussing what we're going to do when the war is over. And then finally, 1941, the Lend-Lease Act. Lend-Lease. We're going to lend you weapons. We'll lease you weapons. When you lease a car, you have to give it back after 2 or 3 years. Think about the ridiculous nature of leasing a tank, or leasing a plane, or leasing a naval ship that's going to be used in battle. We go from neutrality acts in 1935, 1937, and FDR, through his rhetoric, through his perseverance, is able to bring America to lending and leasing weapons to England in 1941. But at this point, America is still not involved in the war, and it's going to take one of the most infamous moments in American history to bring us to war. Some people say that the Japanese did what FDR could not. The bombing of Pearl Harbor is going to galvanize America's resolve to get involved in this war. Famously, FDR says December 7th is a day that will live in infamy. Prior to 9/11, I think it's probably the single most famous day in American history. 50, 60 years later, we still celebrate it, driving into work on December 7th. The DJs are going to remind everyone, the newscasters and that night's newscasts are going to tell you it's December 7th. December 7th. I want to mention something, but I want to be really careful about it because I don't think it's true at all, and I don't think many people do. But in that there's a degree of conspiracy about this. Some people say that FDR knew that the Japanese were going to bomb Pearl Harbor and allowed them to do it, knowing that it would encourage America to get involved in the war. Now, I don't believe that personally, but the rumors and the idea that some people do believe that speaks to just how much FDR was trying to move America towards war and just how resistant Americans were. This is a huge difference between World War I and World War II, and certainly as you guys think about the assignment that you have to do at the end of this thing, this is going to be a huge difference between World War II and Vietnam. Can you imagine the Americans of 1941 getting involved in a war in Southeast Asia? I mean, here World War II is raging on. Europe is on the brink of falling to Nazi Germany, and America still didn't want to get involved in the war. That's a huge difference. Now, I don't want to do your homework for you, but just to give you an idea of things that you can be thinking about. Okay, this is a real quick one. I think when we talk about it comparing World War I and World War II, World War I is particularly famous for these posters. I showed you posters, Halt the Hun, famously the Uncle Sam, We Want You poster, some of those really powerful posters with the German soldiers dragging a young girl, to God knows where in the middle of the blazing fire. World War I is particularly known for those posters, but World War II as well. I'm going to show you posters when we talk about women in the war, famously Rosie the Riveter, but I just thought I'd mention it briefly. Certainly, if you had an essay about World War I and World War II, you talk about war bonds, you talk about victory gardens, the idea of conserving resources, whether it be food or tin or oil. Both of those are true of World War I and World War II. A little bit better known, I think, during World War I, but every bit as important in World War II.